Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to our Lunch and Learn. I'll invite us to begin with our opening prayer. Almighty God, source of wisdom and understanding, watch over the United States during this time of election. Keep safe all candidates, election officials, poll workers, and voters. Help us to listen in love, work together in peace, and collaborate with one another as we seek the betterment of our community and world. We offer this prayer through Christ our Lord. Amen. Wonderful. It's so good to be with you all on this short week. My name is Jessie Bazan. I'm the Associate Director of the Benedict Institute, and on behalf of my colleagues, Roger Narlock, our Director, and Catherine Rupp, it's so good to have you here. And we're excited to also be with Father Nicolas Becker, a monk of St. John's Abbey and a member of the theology faculty at CSB and SJU. Father Nicolas earned a license and doctorate in sacred theology from Rome's Alfonsian Academy, a school of the Pontifical Lateran University. He has written on conscience and virtue in the thought of John Henry Newman, as well as questions of religious liberty around the coronavirus pandemic. Father Nicolas also bravely serves as a faculty resident in a first-year Johnny Residence Hall. He's admired by students and colleagues alike for his kindness, quick wit, and intellect. Today, Father Nicolas will be sharing some wisdom from the Rule of Benedict and Catholic social teaching as we move ever closer to the 2024 election.
Good morning. Thank you very much. Thanks so much for coming today. I really appreciate that, though I know as I drove the back way from St. John's that just getting out and seeing the fall colors on such a beautiful autumn day was in itself a good reason to come over. I'm so pleased to see such a good, well, first of all, I should warn you, this is my first time with a lunch and learn experience. So if there are any other first timers here, I can say that I've been told that I should speak for about 25-ish minutes, leaving some time for Q&A at the end. Q&A is required. If you're quiet, I have ways of making you talk. But we're going to stick pretty. I think Roger's going to come up just before 12:30 and make a few announcements, and we're going to stick pretty precisely to the 12:30 stopping date, just so you all stopping time, just so you all know what's going on. And I have to say, one of the things I'm so pleased about is to see such a wide kind of sampling of our community here today. People in a number of different roles here. Everyone's very welcome. But I do have to confess, I'm particularly pleased to see, I shall not name names to protect the guilty, but 4 former students of mine who graduated from these schools and joined the staff at CSB SJU. I'm so pleased by that because in many cases these were people who were literally compelled to sit through me for a full semester. So the idea that they would come back for more is kind of very pleasing to me. So it's good to see them in a particular way as well. Just to give you a sense of kind of what I hope to achieve with you all today, our agenda is this. I want to start with a few introductory remarks basically around fundamental moral theology in the Catholic tradition. I want to talk about voting itself. I want to talk about voting as an act of conscience, and I want to talk about voting as an act of prudential judgment. And then just to be creative, of course, the Rule of Benedict was not written kind of with civil elections in mind, but we've been thinking about for the past year or two kind of, the rule does set out provisions for electing an abbot, and we at St. John's have been thinking about that for the past year or two. So there are a couple principles from that I would just like to lift up for us in terms of formation of conscience as we prepare to vote. And then I would like to move on as time permits and talk through some aspects of Catholic social teaching around the formation of conscience for voting, and then conclude with suggesting some other resources for you and answering what questions you may have. I mean, I'm hoping that pretty much everyone here will vote. One of the great things about ethics is, in addition to being a theoretical discipline, it's a very practical discipline. It's about what we do and don't do. And ideally, since we're going to vote, we'll have questions about kind of how the tradition can help us form our conscience. So just to give you a sense of what we're going to do, that's kind of our agenda today. To start, one question I get often is that, do I have to vote? Am I morally obligated to vote? And the tradition has some interesting things to say about that. Maybe the strongest statement comes from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. 2239 you can read, but 2240, submission to authority and co-responsibility for the common good make it morally obligatory to pay taxes, to exercise the right to vote, and to defend one's country. At least among magisterial sources, I mean, there are lots of statements about the importance of participation, and we'll see that when we get to Catholic social teaching. But I would say that's probably the single strongest statement around the idea of voting as a moral obligation. I would probably say, I mean, personally, and we'll get to an exception in just a moment, but I would probably tend to argue that unless excused by pretty serious reasons, I would tend to argue that we have a moral duty to participate in our democracy, and one of the basic ways we participate in our democracy is a moral duty to vote. And to be honest with you, I probably don't need to say that to a crowd of Minnesotans, that the latest statistics we have suggest that about 80% of Minnesota adults vote regularly. But I do want to lift up to you that even in a state that tends to be as civilly engaged as Minnesota, the statistics for college students, 18 to 22-year-olds, the statistic I saw was right around 40% vote. So there's still some kind of work that could be done. There's a quote that's famously attributed to Theodore Hesburgh, the former president of the University of Notre Dame: voting is a civic sacrament. But the one great exception I wanted to lift up, or the one area kind of where this gets sticky, is that there have been some prominent, at least in the Catholic tradition, some prominent Catholics who have conscientiously refrained from voting. And Dorothy Day is perhaps kind of the most famous example, kind of one of the most prominent kind of Catholic activists of the 20th century, and she refused to vote. And even when you read through all her materials, her letters and diaries and all this, she never gives a systematic explanation as to why she doesn't choose to vote. But I give you this little quote from the director of a documentary film that was done on Dorothy Day just a handful of years ago. Dorothy Day was clearly the most outspoken Catholic conscience for America in the 20th century, yet she did it without participating at the ballot box. She did think of herself as an anarchist, so I can only assume that while you castigate the power structures, you can't at the same time support them with your vote. And even in the literature, there have been some interesting articles in recent years, past 10, 20 years, about what is the morality of voting third party? What is the morality of refusing to vote in the American context? And so there is some discussion for that, but I mean, my personal suspicion is that those people who don't vote, conscientious reasons by and large, for a large percentage of them are probably, not, why not? I want to talk a little bit about voting as an act of conscience. Conscience is a word in the moral tradition that's thrown around quite a lot, and it's often done so kind of without kind of a more precise notion of how conscience is understood. I guess the first thing I want to say is that conscience is usually held up as a human faculty, not as a religious faculty, that every human being has a conscience. It's not specifically kind of around religion. We could speak of conscience as a judgment of reason about the moral quality of an act. And there are two traditional aspects of conscience that are worth lifting up. a knowledge of general moral principles, and an application of those principles to particular situations. So to give you an example of that, the natural law tradition, most natural law traditions will suggest that there are certain things that we should know morally by use of reason alone, that no one should have to tell us. So for example, a general moral principle would be, it is good to help the poor. That is something that one should know. And that's one of the functions of conscience. Conscience should avail us to these general moral principles. A second function of conscience, and this is really kind of where the rubber meets the road, is how to apply those general moral principles to particular situations. So to give you kind of an example of this, it was mentioned in my intro that I did my graduate studies in Rome. And I lived at Sant'Anselmo, the International Benedictine house in Rome, and I studied at the Alfonsiana, the Alfonsian Academy. For those of you who know Rome, it's right by Termini. And so most mornings, I would walk to school. When I had lectures, I would walk to class, and I would usually be wearing this, and a 35, 40-minute walk. And from the time that I left where I lived and arrived at my school, I probably would encounter, depending on the day, 6 to 10 people, street people, who would ask me for a handout. Conscience would tell me it is good to help the poor. Conscience also tells me what is the best way to respond to this particular person. Conscience has both of those functions. And conscience, as I say, where conscience meets the road is the application of general moral principles to particular situations. Maybe two principles that are worth lifting up about conscience. Conscience must be formed with care. It's not simply a matter to assert, I am following my conscience and then kind of do what you will. That's not the idea. That conscience makes you responsible for your moral choices, but the fundamental moral choice is to actually form my conscience with care. And I don't want to get too much into the weeds on that, but I just want to gesture to that. And also, you may never violate your conscience. You should never act against your conscience. You should never act against your conscience. If you know something is wrong and you feel coerced to do it, if there's any way you can avoid it, you ought. If you know something is right, you ought not be, prevented from doing it. The other thing is, one of the reasons, and I mean, in one of my moral theology classes, I devote a lot of time to conscience, and one of the reasons why I do is conscience is what allows us to be responsible moral agents. I can only take responsibility for my choices if I genuinely am making them. And one of the great lines from Pope Francis's teaching in 11, 12 years he's been in office comes from a document called Amoris Laetitia, where he says, and he's really making reference to the church in this context, the Catholic Church, the church has been called to form consciences, not to replace them. That's why, jumping ahead to the question of the day, no one from a religious perspective should ever tell you how to vote. And I would say that Catholic social teaching, the Catholic tradition, is at its best when it can lift up principles and invite its people to kind of form their consciences around them. Yes, it's true that because Catholicism in particular is a worldwide religion, there have been particular kind of political and social contexts where the church has been compelled to take a different role. But in any reasonably healthy democracy, that's really what the church should do. The other thing I want to say about conscience before kind of turning to kind of the Benedictine material is that conscience is an act of prudential judgment. It depends on the virtue of prudence, which is probably my favorite virtue. Prudence can be defined a lot of ways. Maybe one simple way of talking about prudence is the virtue that helps us to see the right thing to do and the best means of achieving it. So ideally, when you first saw the Lunch and Learn ad, you said, well, gosh, I'm going to have to vote. So maybe I could devote an hour to thinking about how to vote carefully and how to vote well. So I will go to that lunch and learn. And then you started to think, well, how do I arrange my schedule on that Wednesday in such a way as to I can be there, kind of that sort of thing. Prudence is what does that, sets the goal and gives you the best means for achieving the goal. There's a late Dominican theologian called Herbert McCabe who defines prudence in a way that I really like, exceptional common sense. That's really what prudence is. That's really what prudence is in kind of a workaday kind of sort of sense of the word. And voting, so voting depends on prudence, and voting is an act of prudential judgment. Prudential judgment means that people of goodwill will disagree on the application of principles to particular situations. That's kind of it. So even if, we talk through kind of some resources from the Rule of Benedict, we talk through some resources from Catholic social teaching, I fully expect that, the thoughtful 60, 75, how many people are here, people will reach different conclusions. And so when you go to the ballot box, you'll vote in a variety of different ways. Yes, it's an act of prudential judgment. Moving on there, to the Benedictine tradition. So as I said in my introduction, I'm well aware of the fact that the Rule of Benedict was not written with civic elections in mind, and I don't want to pretend that it is. And I don't want to make the Rule of Benedict has something to say for every occasion. But nonetheless, I actually do think when Roger first approached me about the possibility of doing this, I'd been thinking a lot because of St. John's experience with the election over the past year or two about kind of chapters 2 and chapters 64, which are the chapters of the rule which deal most explicitly with the office of abbot and the process of electing and installing the abbot, that I thought, well, maybe there could be some things from there kind of that could be mined. In the rule, Benedict, of course, specifies that the abbot has to be elected by the monastic community. Sometimes people who are kind of fairly familiar with the Catholic tradition will kind of raise their eyes at that because within Catholicism today, there's a rich history of appointing leaders. But Benedictine monasticism, traditionally, for its principal leader, has put a premium on elected by the community. And that's perhaps not so surprising when you consider the fact that the Rule of Benedict comes from the 6th century, where the widespread practice in the early church at that time was that the local bishop of each diocese was elected by the clergy of that diocese as then confirmed by the people. So in a certain sense, what Benedict is setting out in his rule is simply applying the practice of the great church kind of to the life of the monastery. Electing an abbot is, of course, not electing a school board member, a mayor, a member of Congress, or a president. And I suspect that all those offices are probably on the ballots that you're going to see or have seen. But I'm going to say that the rule does have wisdom that can apply to elections. And what I want to do is I want to zoom in particularly on 2 chapters of the rule to make that argument. Chapter 2 on the qualifications of an abbot, and chapter 64 on the election and installation of the abbot. So let's move on into chapter 2. Chapter 2 is a great big long chapter, and I don't want to kind of give you the whole thing, but let me just lift up a few things. Furthermore, anyone who receives the name of abbot is to lead his disciples by a twofold teaching. He must point out to them all that is good and holy, more by example than by words, proposing the commandments of the Lord to receptive disciples with words, but demonstrating God's instruction to the stubborn and the dull by a living example. Not that there are any of those in the monastery. Again, if he teaches his disciples that something is not to be done, he neither must do it, lest after preaching to others he himself be found reprobate, and God someday call him to his sin. How is it that you repeat my just commands and mouth my covenant when you hate discipline and toss my words behind you? And also this, how is it that you can see a splinter in your brother's eye and never noticed a plank in your own? What I want to lift up there is that in the Rule of Benedict, the abbot has to be a competent teacher. The abbot has to be a competent administrator. The rule provides for both of those things. The Rule of Benedict gives the abbot basically unlimited authority over his monastery, an authority that we note is not sustained by contemporary canon law. In canon law and in the law of the American Cassinese congregation to which St. John's belongs, for certain acts, the abbot needs the consent of the senior council or the consent of the monastic chapter. One famous monastic scholar laments this as a corruption of the Rule of Benedict, that Benedict wants the abbot to have kind of absolute power over the monastery. Nonetheless, the Rule of Benedict insists that not simply teaching or administrative ability matters. In electing an abbot, character matters. Who are you electing? What sort of man is he? So one of the principles that I think I would like to lift up for this when we form our conscience in terms of casting about in a few weeks, when we're voting for someone for any office, their platform, their policies, of course, are important, and who they are is also important. A question of character is key. This is one of the reasons why around any election, I'll have students, and I often get asked to do a talk that is like this for different venues. People will ask me in the past that there can be so many offices to vote for and so many people running. How can they really make an informed vote when they don't kind of know anything about all the candidates for the school board or all the candidates to be kind of judge or something like that? I'm going to suggest that there's not an easy solution to that problem, but nonetheless, I do want to suggest that when we prepare to vote, making some judgments, having a sense of someone's character is kind of actually important. Moving on from there to chapter 64 on the election of an abbot. In choosing an abbot, the guiding principle should always be that the man placed in office be the one selected either by the whole community acting unanimously in the fear of God or by some part of the community, no matter how small, which possesses sounder judgment. Benedict does have this idea that the community could delegate to a smaller segment of the community the responsibility of election. Goodness of life and wisdom in teaching must be the criteria for choosing the one to be made abbot, even if he is the last in community rank. Benedict is not it's remarkably clear, his instructions to his communities about kind of how they should make a judgment. Once in office, the abbot must keep constantly in mind the nature of the burdens he's received and remember to whom he will have to give an account of his stewardship. Let him recognize that his goal must be profit for the monks, not preeminence for himself. He ought therefore to be learned in the divine law so that he is a treasury of knowledge from which he can bring out what is new and what is old. He must be chaste, temperate, and merciful. He should always let mercy triumph over judgment so that he too may win mercy. He must hate faults but love the brothers. When he must punish them, he should use prudence and avoid extremes. Otherwise, by rubbing too hard to remove the rust, he may break the vessel. He is to distrust his own frailty and remember not to crush the bruised reed. Let him strive to be loved rather than feared. And there's one more money quote from the chapter that I wanted to lift up for you. Excitable, anxious, extreme, obstinate, jealous, or over-suspicious he must not be. Benedict wants the abbot to be a pretty chill figure, kind of to put it more informally. Therefore, if you go down to verse 19 there, therefore, drawing on this and other examples of discretion, the mother of virtues. Discretion is a synonym in the tradition for the virtue of prudence. That one of the chief virtues the abbot is supposed to have, we talked about in terms of forming your conscience for voting, is the virtue of prudence. How to make kind of good judgments in particular situations. Benedict there refers to it as the mother of virtues. The classical tradition actually refers to prudence as the charioteer of the virtues that directs all of the other virtues kind of to their proper end and goal. Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas actually argue that there's such a thing as what they call political prudence that is well suited for those who are in political power. How can I best serve the common good? It's very important to remember that in the Catholic tradition, certainly in contemporary Catholic social teaching, but this goes all the way back to Aquinas and Augustine, public service is a noble vocation. It's a noble thing to do. That the abbot needs to know how to recognize and achieve the good in their own life and in the life of the community that they have been charged to govern. All right, I'm aware of time, and I do want to leave at least some time for questions. So let me just say, I would say those are the resources from the rule that I wanted to lift up for you in terms of conscience formation and voting. Let me conclude today, before we get to our resources and questions, just by refreshing you on a word or two about the 7 principles of Catholic social teaching as you evaluate candidates and as you evaluate platforms in terms of, and I mean, of course, this emerges from Catholic social teaching, but I really would like to propose these as good ideas for any person of goodwill, that I think you could do worse than base your vote off these, if I'm honest with you. Maybe the most basic principle of Catholic social teaching, the life and dignity of the human person. Human life is sacred, and the dignity of the human person is the foundation of a moral vision for society. The Catholic bishops of Minnesota have done a really good job in getting ready for this election, and they call particular attention to a document just released this past spring called Dignitas Infinita, Infinite Dignity. And what it really talks about, one of the provocative claims it makes, is talking about human dignity as functional versus ontological. And the difference that's being made there is, so I'm a human person, and I have infinite dignity, so is the argument made. The question that's often raised is, what if, God forbid, my life becomes a moral disaster? Do I lose my human dignity? What this document is making the claim is that dignity is actually ontological, that it rests with the being of the person as opposed to functional, that even if my life, God forbid, becomes a moral disaster, I retain my dignity. Call to family, community, and participation, also known as the common good. No person is an island. The human person is hopelessly social. The United States traditionally has a great emphasis on the rights of the individual. I mean, the United States is really a child of the French Revolution and a weak sense of the common good. There's a wonderful definition of the common good, but we could say it more informally as the sum total of all the conditions that lead to human flourishing, both as individuals and as a community. Maybe the most important thing I want to say about the common good in this context is that some people, when they talk about the common good, they set the common good in opposition to the private good. That's not such a good idea. In the Catholic tradition, the common good includes the private good. It's not the common versus the private. It's what's the best for me and the best for everyone, and making a prudential judgment kind of around that. Right, and I do want to watch time. Rights and responsibilities, maybe the only thing that I want to say here is that Catholic social teaching has a rich sense of human rights. Something that I think that the tradition makes that's a great contribution is claiming that there are corresponding duties and responsibilities to every right. We don't just talk about rights, we talk about duties. Option for the poor and vulnerable. The moral test of any society is how the weakest and most vulnerable are treated. The dignity of work and the rights of workers. There's a rich tradition in Catholic social teaching of advocating for the rights of workers, unionizing, just wages, just working conditions, this sort of thing. Solidarity. There is no them, it's just us. That we are one human family regardless of national, racial, ethnic, economic, or ideological differences, and we are the keeper of our sisters and brothers. And then finally, solidarity, care for God's creation. That stewardship of creation, care for the earth, is a basic responsibility of the Christian faith. Then if you stuck a gun to my head and said, well, that's great, but it's kind of complicated, can you give me the Cliff Notes version? I would say it's that. when I get ready to vote, I'll make my judgments around those three principles. That's my personal bias. All right, we're almost there. In terms of time, I do want to leave a little time for questions. Let me kind of proceed to this slide. If you want yet more resources in deciding how to vote, those are some excellent websites in terms of doing it. Well, I would like to lift up an initiative of the Catholic bishops of this country that I've appreciated, the idea of civilize it. Civility as a civic virtue. I mean, we know kind of, I'm only in my late 40s. I've been voting in presidential elections since 1996. If you had told me when I was in college that this would be the state of the democracy, I would have been shocked. But here we are. And Twitter probably hasn't helped. But there it is. Why don't we, I know that we got about 10 minutes before Roger has to join us and do announcements. So talk to me, what's on your mind? Questions, comments? Go ahead.
I appreciate the three.
The big three?
Yeah.
Sure.
So do you think traditionally most people do think about those three things when they vote? Or they vote just Democrat or Republican, whether they review those three pieces or not?
I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, I'm sure that many people kind of vote along partisan lines. There's a famous principle that people vote their pocketbook. I'm sure that people vote how they vote for a lot of reasons. One of the reasons why I get asked to do versions of this talk, and I like to do versions of this talk, is I think that these are also, in practical decisions about voting from your pocketbook, I understand why people do that, and I'm in a way of life where that's not quite as much of a stress for me. But having said that, I would like to lift up some other values that I think are worth considering. Yeah. Sure. So go ahead.
Thank you very much for your wisdom. I was struck by, I was thinking about this question, and then you began to address it, the question about the common good. So I think about it often, it seems to me, the common good and what's good for me are not always in sync.
Yeah.
How do you sort that out?
I think that's a great question. The question really was, the common good, what's good for everyone and what's good for me are not necessarily in sync. How do I sort that out? It would vary from situation to situation, of course. To answer in a general way, I would say I think that's one of the key reasons why the virtue of prudence is so essential. But what I did want to kind of underline and emphasize is that the common good in the Catholic tradition, the good of the whole is not set in opposition to the private good. It's win-win, and you have to make difficult judgments about how that's going to be realized. And I wish there were easy and happy answers, but there aren't always. But become prudent and it'll be easier. Go ahead.
Thank you for this information. You also mentioned that character is key.
Yeah.
And I just, it's difficult in these times because you get one side saying this is a lie, the other saying,
Yes.
there's it's very hard to form an opinion.
Yep.
And any insight as to how to do so?
It's living in what's often been referred to as a post-truth culture, where there are alternative facts. I think that those are real challenges. And it's funny, I'm teaching a section of Integrations 100 right now, and we were just having this conversation in class. One of the things that I was saying to them that I think is worthwhile is get your news from a number of different sources. That I think that's a good idea, and listen carefully and make prudential judgments about what you're hearing. it's not approaching kind of news naively or simplistically, I think is very, very important, particularly now. Sure. Oh, go ahead, John.
Thank you.
Certainly.
As always.
Yeah.
Pleasure to hear you speak here.
Bless you.
I would say, you mentioned earlier talking about straight ticket vote. Do you think there's a time when it could be morally responsible to vote straight ticket voting? For example, if you aren't well informed necessarily, if you are generally aware of some of the characters or flaws of certain party line ideas, do you think that could be a consideration, or is it generally better to look independently at each?
At issue by issue. So that I think that's a great question, and I'm a little leery of it because I want to get. I would be crushed if someone kind of walked away from this experience saying he's telling us how to vote, or he's telling us not how to vote. I certainly think that one could make a prudential judgment, kind of that. Of a number of different approaches that I think a responsible person could do. I think that I could see situations where that would be appropriate. I could see situations where filling out your ballot incompletely, not voting for kind of this or that office because you don't feel that you're informed to vote for this particular office, I think that could be a responsible choice. I think that writing someone in can be a responsible choice. That what I'm most interested in is lifting up what I think are responsible choices as opposed to kind of particular solutions. Sure, go ahead.
Thank you. You talk about prudential voting a lot.
Yeah.
Some people are arguing that you should vote for a third-party candidate even though I have no chance of winning. I remember doing that once in '96 when it was perfectly clear who was going to win Minnesota.
Yeah.
So I could afford to vote for a third-party candidate as an expression. But this year, where it's not obvious at all, is it prudential to vote for a third-party candidate when you know it's going to be one of two people who are going to win?
I think that's, I can say within the field of social ethics, that very question is hotly debated. And I think that the prudent person needs to weigh the different considerations and make a judgment there. And I can say that in my own calculus, I think because of the electoral system, where you live and where you happen to vote, that does change the calculus of how you choose to vote and what the latest polls are kind of in Minnesota. My own view is that I think that voting third party or writing candidate in, if done in a thoughtful way, can be a morally responsible act. My father used to, when we would talk about this, my father used to tease me that, if you do that, you're throwing your vote away. And maybe it's just because I have a soft spot for genuinely conscientious actions. I can, in a certain sense, support genuinely conscientious actions that are perhaps not that useful. But maybe I'm just gloriously impractical. Or as they say, the joke that's said in monastic life, one abbot saying to another, "I'll give you 5 musicians for a plumber." Go ahead.
I think too, it's sort of in relation to that question. Sometimes I think a vote can be driven not just by how you feel about the candidate that you're voting for, but also by how you feel about the candidate that you are not voting for, right? So like how does that sort of play in your terms of considering like a prudential judgment? How does that play in? What are your thoughts?
So I think that one thing I would say is that prudential judgments and conscientious judgments are ultimately, and it's not saying that your feelings are not important, but they're both ultimately judgments of reason. So in a certain sense, and my reason, if it's functioning well, it's going to be informed by my passions, it's going to be informed by my feelings, but it's not going to be dominated by them. I think that the factors that you mention, voting more against someone than voting for someone, I can see where that could be a responsible moral calculus for a vote. I think that when you close if you vote in person, I tend to vote absentee, but that's just me. If you vote in person, once the curtain closes, there are all sorts of, I think, responsible acts. And I could see where the path that you're suggesting could be one responsible act. What I would say to that person is, why are you doing what you're doing? And how are you, these very principles that I lift up, particularly the big three, how does the voting choice you're making engage with that? And if you can give me a coherent response there, I'm probably going to say I think that's pretty responsible, even if I'm voting differently. Go ahead.
You were going to talk about the lesser of two evils.
Oh, sure.
But I do think that came out a little bit in Sarah's question.
Yeah.
So I'd like to ask you, to students who think their vote doesn't matter,
Sure.
right? Or to young people who think it doesn't matter, either because of the electoral or disenfranchised. A number of students in our office recently just kind of feeling deflated by politics and disengaged. Many of us working with students and maybe asking them, are you involved or not involved? What would you say to students? Is there any wisdom we can draw from the rule, or what you're saying about why their participation matters?
So I don't necessarily think that I don't think there are easy solutions to that. But one thing I would say is that I think in many cases it's good to be a little more free of outcomes. That we tend to think in terms of utility, but not everything in life is measured by that. So simply to show up for something may not have great use, it may not have great utility, but it's still important. And again, the Catholic social teaching, the idea of participation, voting is kind of a low bar there in terms of participation. I personally tend not to choose to vote in primary elections because I'm not active in a partisan way. But I do vote in general elections. So even if, just to try to persuade students that just start showing up. In a certain sense, it comes back to kind of the same arguments that are used around, doing small things to care for the environment. That, it may, if you, bother to recycle, it may feel like a small thing and it doesn't really make a difference. And I can't remember what sociologists say is the name of this effect. But if everyone does that one small thing, it suddenly starts to make a difference. That, it's something that's, because utilitarianism is the dominant moral philosophy in the West, it's important to try to persuade people that there's a value to acts that don't necessarily have immediate use. Sure. Oh, Roger's telling me to move, so thank you kindly.
Thank you so much, Father Nicolas. That was wonderful. I'm Roger Narlock. I'm director of the Benedict Institute, and I just have a few announcements about upcoming events that we have going on. The first one is the simplest and most regular, which is every Friday we have Building Community, which is an opportunity for you to just have free coffee and donuts and get to meet other members of our faculty and staff and administration. This Friday, it is in the main building at St. Ben's in the fireside room where it normally is in that building on the first floor. And this year we are doing a little different thing with Building Community. Is each time we host it, we are identifying kind of guests of honor. So we're specifically inviting certain departments that will make a more special effort to show up, and you can meet members of those departments. This Friday, those departments will be the nursing and math academic departments. So come and meet them as well as others. Everybody's always invited. The second announcement is about our next Lunch and Learn, which is November 11th, also at St. Ben's. Almost all of our programming we offer on both campuses back and forth. On November 11th, artist Mary Bruno will be talking about the Rule of St. Benedict scroll that she made. She made the Rule of Benedict in scroll form. It is currently on display in the lobby of the BAC, so you can take a look at it, and she'll be talking about her process of making it and what she learned about Benedictine wisdom as part of that process. So again, that will be November 11th in this very room. And if you want to sign up for that, try to find it online, but also we have QR codes that are on the tables up front that if you're having a hard time finding forms to sign up, you can just scan that QR code and sign up right there. The last announcement is in relationship to a little bit of a tweak to our program that we've done this year. Is in the past we've done Benedictine education programs for people who want to get more well-versed on Benedictine spirituality and our Benedictine mission. This year we call them Benedictine 101. And whether you've taken a Benedictine education program course or the Benedictine 101, or you just simply have a basic understanding of Benedictine mission from whatever source, and you want to learn more, this year we're starting Benedictine 201 sessions as well. These aren't formal classes, we're just drawing upon that name. But basically the 201s are meant to be more of a special topics rather than a general orientation to our Benedictine mission. And our first 201 will be beginning Halloween and will run every Thursday from 3 to 4 for 4 weeks. So 4 sessions to that, and it's called Benedictine Tradition of the Arts at St. John's University. And will include tours of the St. John's Bible, the Abbey Woodworking Shop, and the organ in the Abbey Church. Space is pretty limited for those, and so again, that's something you need to sign up for, the totality of the 4 sessions. And if you're having difficulty with the sign up, that too is on a QR code as you come in. With that, I wish you a wonderful Wednesday and have an awesome fall with the beautiful leaves.